Screencastify should be on. How do I pause it? I think I have Screencastify recording. I think I'm in the Cami, so I should be able to highlight or underline the beginnings of the American tradition. Did that highlight on the screen? Yes, it did. Okay, so I am capable of highlighting on the screen. Okay. So I'm going to scroll. All right. We're going to sail across the ocean to America and start studying, hopefully, the literature, American literature, because we've looked at Anglo literature. So we're going to go across the ocean and look at some American literature. Hopefully, notice the difference between Anglo European and American. Yes, Joe.
I read it Portuguese.
Okay. Guess what? I'll give you a guess. What's going to happen?
Very great eighth period.
Yes, there you go. All right. Meanwhile, I'll keep going with what I was going to read. I think I can underline with this little laptop and have it show up on the screen. Let's see whether that works. They gave this old-fashioned thingy here. It's a shipping broadside, part of a list of ships, including the Mayflower, equipped by the Virginia Company of London for voyages to the New World. And you notice how it was all just printed right in a row. It was hard to make stuff printed. A note of the shipping men and provisions sent and provided for. It was hard for them to, set type. It was all done by hand back in those days. So they didn't have computers doing it. So some guy just lined up all the letters, and that's it. That's how it ended up. Okay. The reading continues. The Eagle has landed. I'm going to scroll. Thus, briefly and eloquently, Commander Neil Armstrong radioed Earth the news that his manned spaceship had just settled on the moon. Christopher Columbus waited until his voyage home before informing Europe that almost by accident he had bumped into the New World. His telling took more than 4 words, in fact, a long letter, but it was too eloquent. He had found, he said, a land to be desired and once seen, never to be left. So you guys know this story. The Europeans sent explorers out, and when they were sailing across the ocean, they found what they called the New World. It was new to them. Of course, it had been there all along, but as far as they were concerned, it was the New World. They thought it was India at the first shot, but then they realized that they had run into a new place. The time between these two tremendous moments in history is almost 500 years, yet both moments arose from the same desire to explore and describe new realms, a desire that also inspired many of the earliest works of American literature. Okay, this desire to explore is part of the American tradition. Okay, so we're going to go across the ocean to America, explore, and then finally settle. For 50 years after Columbus's voyage, Europeans explored the New World actively. Some hoped to find a faster trade route to China. Others hoped to find the fabled earthly paradise containing a cure for all diseases, rivers filled with gold, and the fountain of youth. Both hopes came to nothing, but the explorers brought back remarkable and often grim stories, particularly about the more than 2,000 Indian tribes they discovered already living on the continent. Books soon told of Cortez, who besieged Mexico City for inhabitants. They told of Cabeza de Vaca, marooned with a few other men in Florida, who, in searching for a European settlement, walked across nearly two-thirds of North America. Other stories about the New World were less grim but more fanciful. They told about a land where people slept underwater, about a king who became a giant by having his bones stretched, about people with hard tails. What? Crazy. Near the end of the 16th century, interest in New World began changing from exploration to settlement. Settlement, they send people to the New World, what they called the New World, to settle down. Desire for adventure and gold remained, but Europeans now began to see America as a place where food was plentiful and where poor people might own land. You remember that one of the problems that people had in feudal Europe is that if you did not own land, you were serf. You were almost a slave. You couldn't do anything. You couldn't go anywhere. You were working for whoever it was who owned the land. If you went to someone else's land, okay, uninvited, you were not welcome. So you were kind of stuck wherever it was you were born, working on that person's land. Unless, of course, you were the person who owned property. Like the earlier explorations, the new interest in settlement produced literature. Inexpensive pamphlets and poems appeared throughout Europe, advertising the attractions of life in America, much as today brochures advertise some vacation spot or retirement village. Typical was the News from Virginia published in London in 1610. To such as to Virginia do purpose to repair, and when they that shall thither come, each man shall have his share. Day wages for the laborer, and for his more content, a house and garden plot shall have. Notice what they're promising. They're promising that people will get their share, which that was not happening in feudal England. Day wages for the laborer, able to control their own wages, and also a house and garden, a, a place to live. The promise of land, good wages, or some other benefit brought for permanent settlers to America, first to the south, shortly afterwards to the north. And the two are different. And the reasons they came to the south and the reason they came to the north are different. And they will affect the literature. Shortly afterward, I did that. Their settlements shaped the future not only of American history, but also of American literature. Okay, so we're going to pause right there for a second. Okay, the next section is the North,
Oh, wait, I have a question.
Puritanism.
When you're putting something in quotes, you put the period like in it, right? Like in the sentence, you put the period before the quotes, right?
Oh, often, well, that's actually a great question. Oftentimes you use a comma because you introduce it
Oh, yeah.
and then you can lead right into the quote. So oftentimes you use your introduction, then you use a comma, and then you start the quote. But there are different ways of punctuating it. Okay, let's go on to the North, Puritanism. In 1620, 100 or so English men and women settled in Plymouth, Massachusetts, to be followed 10 years later by about another 1,000 who settled around Boston. Most of these settlers came not so much seeking the New World as fleeing from the Old. For decades, they had battled with the English authorities over the right to practice their religion known as Puritanism. One Puritan published a pamphlet promising drastic reforms in the Church of England. Authorities put him in jail and also fined him and whipped him and cut off the tops of his ears and burned his forehead and slit his nose. Although eager to escape such trials, most Puritans left the Old World reluctantly. If settlement in America meant an end to harassment, it also meant leaving friends and relatives and facing a wilderness. But basically, the Puritans were living in England, but England had established its own church, the Church of England, and the Puritans wanted to revert to what they thought was a purer form of religion and go back to the simplicity of Jesus's time, because by this time, 1620, the church had become pretty established. It had, taken 1,600 years, but the church was established, and they had all kinds of rituals, and they had hierarchy, and they had gold and silver and fancy churches. And the Puritans wanted to return back to a pure practice of the religion with no fanciness. And they said so out loud, and the people of the Church of England were not happy with this. You'll notice that there is a timeline for you to look through to try to put everything into perspective. Puritanism was a way of life and cannot be summarized in a few words. Yet, three beliefs pervade Puritan writing and three beliefs pervade Puritan writing and deeply influenced later American culture. First, Puritans wished to have their feelings radically changed, an experience they called grace. They wished to cleanse themselves of envy, vanity, and lust so as to love God and God's creation wholeheartedly. But they recognized that people cannot simply decide to convert their feelings. No amount of prayer, church going, or Bible reading can make people love what they do not love. Puritans believed that feelings could be changed only through grace, the miracle by which God grants some people the ability to truly love. They spent much of their lives examining their feelings for signs of grace. This was a slightly different concept than they were going through with the Church of England. Church of England was relying on tradition and doctrine and practice. These guys wanted God to come down and give them grace. Second, Puritans valued plainness, especially in religion. They desired to return Christianity to the simple forms of worship described in the New Testament. This meant eliminating, and we're going to go by this thing called a woodcut. This is an illustration that would show up in a book, and it was actually made by carving a piece of wood into a stamp. And then you could stamp the ink onto the piece of wood and then stamp it onto the piece of paper. They did not have any way of making pictures in a book. So this was what's called a woodcut, and it was, physically stamped onto the paper. And that is an attempt at a map of what New England looked like. And everything is out of proportion because they didn't have modern technology. Okay, the Puritans wanted to simplify and clean up the religious practices that had come into being since the time of Christ, which the Puritans regarded as not God-given commands, but as human decorations. In striving for plainness, they met for worship not in ornate cathedrals with stained glass windows, but in square wooden buildings painted white and stripped of ornament. And you'll notice in the Northeast, the influence of Puritanism on the buildings. You see a lot of square, white churches. We're going to be also looking at the influence of Puritanism on the literature. Third, the Puritans' conviction that they were carrying to America true Christianity as decreed by God led them to see their lives in the New World as a divine mission. They believed that America was a place specially appointed by God to be an example to the rest of the world, a city upon a hill. They thought that God gave them America as a place for them to practice this religion and establish an example of how religion is supposed to be practiced. Like others before and after them, the Puritans wrote about their encounter with America in a variety of forms. Many Puritans kept diaries, attempting to trace the rise of grace in their souls. Puritans who achieved grace often told of their experiences in a form called the spiritual autobiography. Among the several Puritan histories, the most impressive is the long, learned Magnalia Christi Americana, the great works of Christ in America, from 1702 by the famous minister Cotton Mather. It contains accounts of the lives of leaders of New England, of the Puritans' conflict with the Indians, and of the notorious witchcraft at Salem. There's a little bit more on the Puritans. I'm going to scroll. Puritans also wrote a great deal of poetry. Later, you will read verse by Anne Bradstreet. We're going to read some of that. Edward Taylor, I'm not sure we're going to read that. The two outstanding Puritan poets. But two Puritan works not included in this anthology deserve mention. The Bay Psalm Book, 1640, a verse translation of the biblical book of Psalms, was the first book published in America. Also, a minister named Michael Wigglesworth wrote a long poem about Judgment Day entitled The Day of Doom, which became immensely popular. It was owned by about 1 out of 35 people in New England, roughly equivalent to a poem selling 6 million copies today. And you remember the reason that people could own books was the invention of the printing press. Before that, books were written one at a time by hand and were extremely rare. Puritanism as a way of life lasted only about a century in America. The zeal of the first settlers began to fade as the villages of, let me scroll a little bit here. Looks like we lost a few words in scrolling. The villages of New England, we lost a few words. I'm just going to pick up where we are. In the new age of reason, as the founders died and were replaced by generations born in America who had not risked slit noses for their beliefs. Okay, so Puritanism started to fade as people started to think and they did not remember the history that their forefathers had endured. Puritanism revived briefly in the 1740s during the Great Awakening when grace seemed to seize masses of people throughout New England, but many of these religious conversions proved short-lived. By the time of the American Revolution, few Americans would have called themselves Puritan. So Puritanism as a practice of religion sort of died out, but it left behind its marks on the literature, which we're going to read some of. And we will see those marks. Okay, the next section is the South, gentlemen planters. So even though the South was first to settle, this anthology decided to start with the North. The South actually started first because people were interested in settling and planting and growing, right? The southern settlements and those of New England were different in several ways. The two regions differed in climate, in manner of settlement, in religion, in ideas of behavior. The South had warmer weather and richer soil, whereas the typical Puritan settlement was a village community populated by friends and acquaintances who had come to America together. The typical Southern settlement was a plantation of several hundred acres, managed by a single planter with the help of numerous black slaves. Many Puritans owned slaves too, but the number of slaves in the North was fewer than in the South. The often long distances between plantations forced each planter to become a civilization unto himself. Each planter had to do his own farming, weaving, and baking, and had to provide his own medical care and entertainment. Occasionally, he traveled to Williamsburg, Charleston, or some other urban center to conduct business and to have a say in political life. The dominant religion of the South was the Church of England, the same church whose forms of worship the Puritans defied. The Southern ideal of conduct, moreover, was represented not by the zealot's soul searching believer, but by the generous, self controlled gentleman, attentive to manners and keenly aware of his obligation to serve the public. So you'll notice that the South really was an extension of what life was like back in England. And the people that came over and established these plantations, these farms, really were kind of like lords. You know, they were kind of like nobles. And since they didn't have any serfs, any people living on the land doing the work for them, they imported slaves. This is how slavery was brought to North America. Was the southern farmers needed workers on their land. They needed serfs, and they brought in slaves. Okay, of course, this way of life would have affected the literature. These qualities are reflected in early Southern literature. Southerners turned their attention not so much inward as outward. They wrote less than Northerners did on religion and more on nature and society. It is in Southern literature that we find some of the most detailed descriptions in early American writing of the wilderness and frontier life, such as William Byrd's History of the Dividing Line, page 35, whereas Puritans usually wrote for instruction or inspiration. Southerners often wrote for amusement or diversion. One of the earliest Southern poems, Ebenezer Cook's The Sot Weed Factor, tells the comic adventures of a tobacco merchant in colonial Maryland. The Puritans detested plays and even passed laws against their performance. But around 716, Southerners erected in Williamsburg, Virginia, the first known theater in America. So here's another big difference. The lifestyle of the Southerner who owns land, they were managing a plantation, so they had time. They weren't suffering. They had people doing all the work for them, and so they had time for recreation. They had time for reading. They had time for writing. The Puritans were trying to establish a pure religion, and they only had time for their religion, and they also were dealing with harsher weather in the north. The beginnings of American literature, explorers seeking the fountain of youth, Puritans longing for grace, Southern planters describing the wilderness, all introduced into American culture ideas and ideals that have endured. Although Puritanism as a way of life vanished, its emphasis on examining and purifying one's feelings lingers in Ralph Emerson's call for Americans to see the world not through the eyes of the past, but freshly as if reborn. The Puritans' insistence on plainness, too, resounds in the spare poetry of Emily Dickinson and the undecorated prose of Ernest Hemingway. The Puritan vision of America as a divinely appointed place pervades later American concepts as the American mission or manifest destiny or the American dream. Similarly, the Southern gentleman's ideal of public service survives in Washington, Jefferson, and other Southern revolutionary leaders. And the planter's closeness to the land lives on in the works of modern Southern writers like William Faulkner. What the explorers, Puritans, and early Southerners share with later American writers most of all is the desire to convey the special quality of life in America, to show how they felt living in a new world, facing new experiences. In various ways, nearly all American writers from the beginning to present have been saying, the eagle has landed. So when we read, we will notice some of this stuff, like the idea that Washington, as our first president, He was one of the Southerners. He was tied to the English way of life. He was not a Puritan. Um, he was tied to the old-fashioned concept of having a king and doing what the king says, and then ruling your people and being fair to your people. Um, so a lot of that, a lot of those concepts come through in the literature, including this concept of the American dream, the idea that America was somehow God-given, and people could come to America and God would enrich their lives. So there we go. Finish up the questions, and you're good to go.